Welcome to Queercast, the Brandon Sanderson podcast. We're a bunch of mega fans bringing you the news, discussion, and a whole lot of gay opinions about Brandon and the Cosmere. Happy Pride Month, everybody! We've got a special episode for you this month to celebrate all things Pride, as well as all the gay, queer, and non-binary characters in our favorite universe. I'm Jessie, and as you can see, the Lord Ruler is dead, and I, as his wife, have usurped his throne. This was the real reason I immigrated, guys. I had to take his throne. I had to get rid of it.
Yeah, the Lady
He's
Ruler
been in power for too long. Somebody
Lady
has to
Ruler.
take him down. The Lady Ruler. Yeah.
Long live the Queen.
Thank you very much.
The Empress.
Yeah. So in honor of this month, we wanted to share a bit about ourselves as well as to give some insight into our experiences in the LGBTQ plus community. So starting us off, I'm bisexual and I use she, her pronouns. Next up, I'd like to welcome Alyx.
Hello, I am Feather or Feather Rider. I also use she, her pronouns, and I actually do not consider myself queer. I've occasionally used labels like I have some aromantic tendencies, but for the most part, I just consider myself straight, cis, and I am here because I have a lot of time in queer communities and lots of queer friends and lots of time in the queer Cosmere fandom specifically. So I tend to be this token straight friend on in lots of my friend groups, and I'm the token straight Shardcaster today. So hi, thanks for letting me be here with everybody. Cool.
Next up, we have Matt.
Matt/Comatose on the forums, and I wore purple on the day I came to kill heteronormativity. I he him pronouns, and I identify as gay.
Next up, we have Shannon.
Hi, everyone. For all you audiophiles out there, you might notice that my sound is different. Just be aware, for those of you who notice this kind of thing, my mic died. So here I am. You know me as Grey or Grey Watch on the forums Discord. I go by she, her, and I am a biromantic asexual.
Next, welcoming Alla.
Hello, I'm Rasarr on the forums and Discord, mostly on Discord. And I have the show and tell for today, since Argent is sadly absent.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Because recently, since the 1st of June was the Children's Day, my parents decided for some reason that their 24-year-old daughter should get more toys. So
There is nothing wrong with that.
Wow.
Wow.
That's very cool.
What is that? Please
I'm
explain.
not sure if this is supposed to be like a specific Pokemon or something, but it's a phoenix. It's a
I
phoenix.
love it.
It's cool.
It has like those
Really
transparent wings, half-transparent wings that move around.
I like it.
It's a nice gradient on the feathers.
Yeah,
I'm
it's
very
kind of-
qualified to speak about feathers in particular.
Yep. Yeah, it's kind of some kind of like transparent plastic.
Very cool.
Yeah, but-
very cool.
Yeah, so now it's decorating my desk.
I love it.
I am very big on soft toys, as
Mhm.
people may be aware. So I am definitely pro getting toys into adulthood.
Okay, so now for the actual functional part of this introduction. Since everyone's identifying themselves, I am the opposite of Shannon when I'm bisexual or pansexual, but aromantic.
Okay, and last but definitely not least is Kadie. Welcome to Shardcast.
Oh, hello. I'm Kadie or AonEne on the forums. Some weirdos pronounce it Eni.
Some weirdos, as in literally the rest of the staff, until we told us that we pronounced it wrong like 2 weeks ago.
Details. I use she, her. I'm panromantic asexual, and I identify as a demigirl. As a demigirl.
Cool.
And I am LadyLameness on the forums and Discord. I also have some show and tell, because Eric and I did the unboxing recently of the Way of Kings Kickstarter, and there was talk about pins and what to do with pins. And I was saying on it that I put pins on my plushies because I don't know what to do with them. And someone on the Discord, who I'm very sorry, I cannot remember who it was, please at me and get up me for forgetting who you are, was saying that they really liked it and they started doing it too. So I thought I would show off some of the pins that I have put on my plushies, and I can also show off some of my plushies. So I am quite the Naruto fan. So here is Gaara, and on him we have a little Kuroko from the Breath of the Wild, which is so cute, and I love it so much. By Gemma Young,
oh my God.
who does a lot of Cosmere art as well, and did like a fantastic Dalinar at the end of Oathbringer, like bringing together the realms. It's real nice.
Clap.
Yes, the clap. It's super great.
Good.
And then I also have a Sasori, which has another one of Gemma Young's pins. This one's a Zelda. There was so many colors, and I took so long to choose one. I could not figure it out. And then I also have the Herondale Crest from the Infernal Devices series by Cassandra Clare, because Illumicrate put out a special edition of them recently, and they are gorgeous. And I put a bunch of pictures into one of the channels in Discord, but
One
they're
of them.
different colors, and
books.
like all of the pages are colored. But then on the actual pages, they've got designs of clockwork as well, because the entire series is about clockwork automatons, and they're just so pretty. But it came with a bunch of extra swag. I have some of the figurines in the background, but I just love the pin, and I have so many nice pins, and I'm like, what do I do with them? So some of these might get pins sometime soon.
You know, Jess, I didn't know you were such a Naruto fan.
I love it. Yeah, I used to be really into it in high school. And then last year, I went through and rewatched the half of the original, and then all of the Shippuden. And when I say all, I mean I skipped every filler arc except the ones that I wanted to watch, because I just wanted to watch the main story. Because I hadn't seen that bit because it wasn't finished when I was watching it in high school. But yeah, I love it. I love it so much. I thought it was like quite a good storyline in the end. You just have to, skip all the filler. But yeah, I also watched it on like double speed, so that did help get through it, because it definitely suffers from that anime thing of just drawing things out where you have one conversation over 20 minutes in an episode. It's like, this didn't need to be this long.
Oof.
So to start us off today, we're going to do a very quick disclaimer about terminology and some of the terms that we're going to use in this episode, mostly because we know not everyone watching will be as familiar with some of these terms, but we don't want to do too much of a dig into a lot of the terminology that is used within queer circles, because it can be very deep and very long. So we just want to do a little bit so people understand what we're actually talking about during this episode.
Yeah. And I think the main thing is just recognizing that terminology is a complicated issue in the queer and LGBTQ plus community. And for this episode, I think we're mostly going to be using terms we're comfortable with or we identify with, but acknowledge that not everyone is going to feel the same way about some of the terms, such as the ones we used when we were introducing ourselves. It's, a evolving area of language, and lots of times it'll depend on the age of the community or your generation demographic. And there's not a standard set that's going to suit everyone. And this is we also recognize this is Shardcast. This isn't a terminology lecture, although it can be a terminology lecture sometimes when it's about Cosmere terminology. But we're not here to kind of provide a primer on queer terms. So if you're new and even the intros is making your head spin, I think we'll include some links below in the
description
link place. And you can check out some of the resources that are there to get you started. But just recognizing that it's not going to be universal, but it's a start in some common uses. And we'll pause if there's like kind of some key things to explain. Well, we might explain that.
Yeah, I imagine if we're talking about specific characters that are queer in the Cosmere, then we'll take a moment to outline like what that actually means for that character. Okay, so question for you all. What do you find unique about consuming media that has queer content, as a queer reader or a straight reader in terms of Alyx? Just what do you find good, bad in the way that it's presented, in the way that it comes across?
I want to say there is something. I don't know if you guys have heard this term before, but like queering the lens or like queering the read. You know, it's Matt's nodding, he knows. That there is definitely a completely different perspective in the way you start to look at the text, the way you look at stories. Whether the author intended to put it there or not, it's like it's almost very death of the author in the fact that what the author intended doesn't really matter to this. Queering the text, this is just there's a way of doing this like just in casual, informal fandom, and then there's like the official literary analysis mode of called queering or queering the text. And it's instead of assuming that everyone is straight or everyone is cis, meaning that they're not trans, they're not non-binary, that they feel comfortable with the label that they were assigned, a gender that they were assigned as a baby when they first came out of their mother. Instead of assuming straightness, assuming cisness, that we intentionally look for places where they could be queer. And that's kind of the one sentence version of this.
Like, it sounds like it gets into things like queer coding and like queer baiting to an extent, but
it could,
like, queering the
yeah.
text just reminds me so much of queer coding.
Yeah.
And people,
it's sort of like from the opposite.
For it, you can see things that could be trying to subtly point towards gay characters or lesbian characters or non-binary friends.
So it kind of reminds me of like how people like the Iliad story, the kind of off topic, but the Iliad, like how people started looking at Achilles and Patroclus like, were they gay?
They were
so realized they were very gay.
They're so gay. You know, and like that's kind of, I think why this came to be, because it's so normal to look at text and just assume that everyone is straight, because if the author hasn't said anything, then that means they're not gay. But then some people, like, it's just taking the opposite. Well, if the author hasn't said anything, why can't they be gay? Why can't they be trans? And that's kind of the ultimate question that is asked, like looking into the absence of information and reading yourself in there.
I know I have had some classes in like analysis, information analysis, things like that. And one of the things that one of my professors talked about was the distinction between evidence for and consistent with. And I think for a lot of people, when you, especially I've found like in the wider Cosmere fandom, when you step outside of the queer circles, you'll talk about like certain characters, you know, being read in sort of like a queer way very widely. And people are like, that's not in the text. Where'd you get that from? That's not, where does it say that that's a thing? Like, you just made that up, right? And it's trying to tell people like a lot of this stuff isn't necessarily like, yeah, there's this point on the page where you said something and that means for sure, definitely it's going to happen. A lot of it is more consistent with, is there maybe a non-queer explanation for why that character did that, why that character said that? Sure, possibly. But you could also take whatever they said or did and read it as consistent with a queer reading for that character. And for a lot of people, that's all you need. That's all you need to headcanon characters in, you know, various fashions. You don't have to have that hard and fast proof in order to start reading these characters in that way. It's just, that's not the way that it works.
And some characters, you don't even need that. Like there's definitely characters out there that maybe in the text there's not even those moments where you could have multiple readings. People are just happy to see this character and in their mind think they are queer in some way because they relate to that character. And the way that they want to relate further is, well, what if this character was my sexuality or my gender? And like, there's a lot out there where people have explored this, particularly fan fiction, to see which directions characters could go in an alternative universe or in an alternative reading or alternative scenario. And like, there's definitely even scenes out there that are similar to scenes within the canon prose where you could just rewrite it subtly and suddenly the meaning is very different, even if it wasn't necessarily there to begin with.
I think also there is a certain type of way of existing in the queer fan circles where there is no one right way to read the text. No, we don't have one reading. There is no reading that is king. We all, it's a kind of exploratory way of existing with the text. So I think that's also part of when you step outside the circles and you get that. Where are you getting that? Where are you getting that from? Point to me in the text where Kaladin said he's gay.
Yeah.
It's like, does he need to say that for someone to want that to be true?
And I think like that ties into something really interesting. I think as queer people out in the world, like times are changing, but like I think just out in the world, I found at least, you become very alert to real life subtext. Like if you're in mixed company, you don't just walk up to someone and say, hey, I'm gay. You kind of suss people out and look for subtext and signals and kind of cultural markers to be like, okay, this person, they have a rainbow bracelet on. Yeah. So they must be supportive. Or this person is, dressed more conservatively and seems kind of uptight. So maybe I should be more careful about how I act around them. And that sort of analysis, I think, transitions really interestingly when you're reading in a transformative way, where you're not just engaging with the text as written, but imagining and expanding from the basics on the page to what else that could mean, and picking up on subtext specifically because you're kind of trained to do that.
That's a super good point. Yeah, how the real life situations where you can't just go and say to everyone. I mean, there might be some places in this world, like we can probably think of like maybe a few cities. They're like, oh yeah, that's a super liberal city. I'm sure you could be out to everyone. But there are, I think, a lot of times and places that still is not the reality, where it's when trying to find others like us, even in the real world, we don't say things like that. We find euphemisms. We look for commonalities in the stories that people are telling us and thinking, oh, is that it? So it's the exact same way that we do read the text, like for fiction. That's actually a super good point, that we do the exact same kind of looking for subtext in the characters the same way we would for real people. Are you safe? Are you like me?
Mm-hmm.
I think it ties back really well to what you were saying earlier, Shannon, about how if it's not mentioned canonically someone's sexuality, it's just assumed they're straight. And I think in like the real world, you don't go up to someone and say, hey, I'm gay or I'm non-binary, is because it's assumed everyone's straight, and it feels weird to people to go up and say, hey, I'm straight, because of course you are. Like, that's what everyone assumes. So it becomes the strange thing because it is out of the norm to say something. And yeah, it's the same as on a page. Like, if it's not said, then there's that assumption.
Absolutely.
Rasarr or Kadie, do you guys have stuff you want to add?
Honestly, I feel like I'm going to sound very simple after all this, conventional queer reading and
we are BSing our way through life. Don't even worry.
Yeah, but I think like there's also, like you were saying, with like the assumption that everyone is straight, not everyone will be reading this like that, because you will, whenever I read a book, I caught myself assuming that every character is bisexual, unless otherwise noted strictly in the text that they are either straight or they are gay. Which, is also very helpful when reading fan fiction, because a character being other sexuality than you imagine them isn't out of character if you already had canon them as attracted to everyone around them.
I mean, yeah, that's how I make my D&D characters, so.
Like, everyone's going to have a different lens when they go into things, and yeah, exactly that. Like, you can go into something and assume everyone's bisexual, and someone else is going to go in and assume everyone's straight, and sometimes it's like that clash when people don't realize that people have these different lenses when they do read, and assume that everyone has the same lens that they're going in with.
I think that's a really astute point, because I think that's where a lot of conflict when people are talking about different headcanons and different readings can arise, is not understanding you are reading the same text, you are seeing the same words on the page, but you're viewing it from a different perspective or a different lens, and lens does impact your reading. I think sometimes, especially if you're not used to talking to people who are reading with different lenses, you assume that the lens you're reading through has no impact, and you are reading this like true objective version of the text.
Yes.
But as you speak with people who are from, different cultures, backgrounds, what have you, you learn to recognize that the differences it makes for how the text comes across can be huge. That's why I think this kind of talking a bit at the beginning about the lens and the kind of unique aspects that we're getting into is important.
People always say, like, don't assume things, don't infer things, just what's there. And, like, to some extent, yeah, but that's just not also how it really works in the real world. You kind of have to assume things about people. And, like, obviously, if you take that too far and then act upon those assumptions, that can be bad. But, like, in every interaction, we will assume something, basically. And that's just how humans work, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And so carrying that over into the text also is just not that awful.
No, I think that dovetails super well with what Matt was saying, like, about like everyone is always making assumptions, and that there is a kind of reader who assumes that what they're reading is the objective reality. Definitely, but we are all making some kind of assumptions. I did want to sort of that does remind me of where I wanted to go with talking about Shallan in this episode. We have a lot of quotes, we have a lot of stuff ready. But how I first wanted to start off this was how Shallan got to be canon bi in the first place. So yes. There is a WOB that where someone, a friend of ours, Silver Stars, asks Brandon on Twitter, "Hey, Shallan is coming off like super attracted to Jasnah. Is she attracted to women?" And Brandon was like, I didn't really intend that, but I can totally see where you're coming from. And yeah, you know what? I can see that. This is a paraphrase. This is not what they exactly said. We can put the text there later. But that's kind of how that happened, was that someone reading had a very different lens for reading Shallan than Brandon did while writing it. And that's kind of I think we're seeing this quite a bit with the queer fandom coming up against what Brandon intended in the text. And there is I think even Brandon started with assumption of straightness and how he began to write Shallan. And I really like how this whole thing developed in that Brandon decided to change his mind, not because he realized he did have that lens. And so seeing Shallan, the moment you take away the assumption that she must be straight, opens up the possibility to all of a sudden the things that Shallan is saying and thinking come off as attracted to women. And I think we have a few of these quotes from Way of Kings and possibly Words of Radiance.
both,
Is there Words
I
of
think.
Radiance?
Definitely Way of Kings.
Definitely Way of
when she
Kings.
first meets Jasnah.
Yeah, I think all the first 3 books are full of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the great thing about Brandon becoming aware of that is Rhythm of War. He like canonically put in deliberate bisexual Shallan, like where she is looking at other women like in a bar when she is with Adolin, and like he's fine with it, but like Brandon has tried to deliberately incorporate that now. And I've definitely seen stuff on Reddit from Brandon where he says he's very grateful when people bring these things up because, like you said, like he did not think about this. He did not look at this originally and see this. And this is a good way for him to get feedback of ways that he can change and explore characters more that he wouldn't have thought of beforehand.
Absolutely.
Well, and Brandon's talked too about how earlier in his writing, he struggled with that kind of assumed straight cis white male character. Like every character starts as that, and then you work your way out from there. And he got into trouble with that with Mistborn because he came up with this really compelling female character with Vin, and then just kind of defaulted on the rest, and then realized like when the series was done, basically, oh man, like I have like one main female character and then a couple pretty cool female side characters that I added in the second and third book. But the core cast is very male dominated. And it's that assumption, right? Like he starts with his own reading. So his willingness, I think, to adjust based on fandom reading and feedback is really interesting. And using the fans and their diverse viewpoints and readings as a tool to make up for, some of the blinders that we all have.
Yep. And he's talked since then about if he was to redo it, he would make Ham a woman, I think it was.
Both Ham and Dog.
And dogs.
Yeah. But I think he could go even further than that and not just gender swap them, but make them trans women.
Yeah.
And I think that would be a really good use of representation to not only put more female characters in, but also represent trans women as well.
I have a really fun headcanon of female Ham as being a lesbian woman with a family. And she has like her
nice.
her lesbian wife that she like keeps safe and their kids. So crossing my fingers, Mistborn TV, whenever that happens.
Someday, maybe. Someday. I think it's, one of the things just to look at the sort of Cosmere fandom in a microcosm, it is really intriguing that Brandon, who is, a straight man, straight cis, Mormon, even, like not very much at all a part of any sort of queer communities, has a lot of queer fans. There are a lot of queer fans of the Cosmere. They make their own communities. They, we're all here after all. And I think, I try to think like, what is it about Brandon's works that he definitely is trying more to, include canon queer characters and things like that. I think a lot of us would say it's still a learning process. He's still working on that. But despite the fact that there are not a lot of queer characters on screen, queer fans still really gravitate toward the books. And I almost wonder why that is, if anybody has like a good answer of what draws you in like that.
It might be partially because Brandon doesn't really write very overt heterosexuality either. Because like you don't get a moment like, and then Kaladin and Breach 4 went to the brothel to cavort with the serving girls or whatever like that. So yeah, you don't really get those moments like this character is very straight and is written as very straight and is talking about how much he wants to, I don't know how much I can say on the Shardcast that isn't After Dark. Yeah, because like you have I don't read much epic fantasy beyond Sanderson, to be honest, but I'm pretty sure you have like in Game of Thrones characters talking about visiting brothels or whatever, and you won't really see that with Brandon's works. I think the most overt would be whatever is happening with nobles in Mistborn, which is not a example of a healthy relationship, and Shallan and Adolin in Rhythm of War, especially, where he's comes within 2 words of saying what they're doing in the sheets. But even then, Shallan is a confirmed bisexual, so it's not really 100% heterosexual either.
It's very black.
Yeah, so I think this gap sort of where you don't really have this overt heterosexuality lets all the gayness flow in. Actually, you know what? There's more heterosexuality in Cosmere than I thought, because you have Ciri and Suzebron and Dalinar and Navani and the 4th worm.
The worm.
So,
oh god.
But still, it's not like they are actually starting to undress each other on page.
No, Brandon does not do that.
Yeah.
And I think that fade to black approach, even in those examples, because Brandon's not, he's telling us what's happening lots of times. He's not showing us. And so we're not getting a lot of the emotional impact of those scenes. And because of that, I think there's a lot more room for alternate readings, So even though you see Adolin and Shallan fading to black in a romantic moment, people are free to say, oh, yep, they're 100% a heterosexual couple. They're doing their heterosexual thing. Or they could say, oh, look at those cute bi nerds kissing. But also they're thinking about all the other boys and girls at other times. Or, if someone had a different reading, there's a lot of room. It's kind of a blank canvas, Brandon's approach to romance and sexuality.
That's exactly where I wanted to go next. It's because Brandon doesn't, even outside the relationships, Brandon doesn't really write characters with sexual romantic as sexual romantic beings. There's a reason Kaladin gets the widest range of readings, from totally straight to possibly repressed homosexual, repressed asexual, because he doesn't feel totally like he's into women all the time. He doesn't feel like he has those kinds of feelings. And this is not just a Kaladin thing. This is just how Brandon writes. There is kind of this absence of sexuality that when you assume straightness, you're like, oh no, of course he's into women. It's just, Brandon's just not a romance writer. But then you can also look at it and be like, Kaladin, regardless of Brandon's skill as a writer, Kaladin does not appear that into women, and since women are the only romantic kind of things that present themselves to Kaladin, the only situations, and he doesn't appear that into him, there's a reading to be had there where, maybe Kaladin, doesn't even know he might have feelings for people who aren't women. There's that idea of compulsive?
Compulsive.
It's not compulsive. I think it's compulsory heterosexuality.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, compulsory heterosexuality. Thank you, everyone. I botched that. Compet, whatever. Oh, and by the way, sorry. I said compet. I said compulsory heterosexuality. Didn't explain what that means. It's sort of a broad term for how our culture assumes straightness, and how, there are a lot of gay people or bi people, anyone who's not straight. It takes some of us a really long time to realize it, because the heterosexuality has been kind of the compulsory experience. Everyone is assumed straight, even yourself. So for me, what happened was I thought I was straight for a really long time into my 20s, because I thought what I was feeling was straightness. Everyone feels this way. Everyone is straight, therefore I'm straight. I wasn't straight. Everyone feels the way I do about men and women. Spoiler alert. everyone feels this way about men and women. I'm supposed to like men, so I think I probably like men and not women. So the way I feel about women is not straight, and I don't like them, so therefore it's just friendships. And the way I feel about men is obviously, yeah, that's great, that tracks, that's straightness. And I don't really feel like super strongly like sexual attraction. Everyone's just joking, and exaggerating, and no one is actually really attracted to anyone. So everyone feels what I feel, and that must be straightness. It's not straightness. It's that assumption that everyone has, even for themselves, that everyone is straight, compulsory. It's this is how the society must function. And there's all kinds of ways you can read the absences that Brandon has in his works. Brandon just has a void, kind of where other writers would have sexual interest or romantic feelings. And you can see this in in other critics, people who don't even like Brandon's writing or who still do assume straightness. I've seen on Reddit people saying Brandon's works are so sexless. These people don't read as people because they don't have desire. I've seen that happen. And I don't totally disagree with that. I'm just gonna take that and make it queer. That's just how I'm going to use that. It's a fact of how he writes.
I just wanted to note real quick, because I come from a very conservative and just we don't talk about these things aren't great background. And so I just wanted to clarify, because I know there are probably at least a few people watching this who are watching this right now and going, but I don't want Brandon to have sex scenes in his works. I don't want everyone to be super horny lusting after each other. And I just want to clarify that that's not quite what we mean, and that there are ways to show not tell and do things like that and show interest in people without it being oh, things happened and stuff, and that there's an in-between there, and that's what we're referring to generally.
It doesn't have to be a porn smut scene to show.
Yeah.
Also, that's a really good point, Kadie, because I think also in a way we're saying for queer readers, Brandon's kind of neutral approach is a good thing, because it does leave so much room for imagination and transformative and multiple different interpretations of character. So even though we're examining it, yeah, I agree. I really like Brandon's style in that way.
So do I. I like having that flexibility, that room where people from different backgrounds can see it how they want. Not just queer readers, but also straight readers. Everyone can kind of see from different angles. And I don't think that's what Brandon necessarily is going for, but it is almost it is appreciated at the same time, because it does give that room to see yourself in the story and see the places where straightness could fit if that's the way you look at it, or queerness could fit if that's the way you look at it. But it is also nice that Brandon has included more actual queer characters as well, to show hey, queerness does exist in the Cosmere, and that is okay, and it's not just assumed straight, which is what I think it would be if Brandon didn't put those characters in as overtly as he did.
Yeah, no, because there's kind of two different things going on, right? On one hand, reading through a queer lens, there's all these transformative things you can do, and headcanons are fun and headcanons are great, but that doesn't mean that canonizing some form of representation is not also important. So yeah, and I think Brandon is aware of this somewhat. I remember he had some discussions early on about Vin and Elaine's relationship, and how Vin and Elaine's relationship could be interpreted a couple different ways with what they're doing before and after marriage. And he wanted it to be kind of ambiguous so that his readers would be uncomfortable with their relationship progressing past a certain point before marriage could read it that way, whereas people who had a different reading could read it a different way. So I think he's alert to that technique. And I think the issue is when it's used predominantly for queer characters, you almost run into a don't ask, don't tell situation where the queer fans are always having to do the mental and emotional labor of transforming the work in their own minds and then explaining it to people and then defending their choice to read it in that way.
Oh, yes.
And that's where the rep becomes important, because it takes some of that labor off to say, this is an acceptable reading. And it's okay to read other characters this way too, because queer characters canonically exist.
And it also helps to validate those genders and sexualities. And like when it takes that emotional labor off queer readers, it's like, hey, no, you also matter. I also just wanted to say really quickly and try and make it explicit that like we do have critiques that we want to talk about with Brandon's characters, with his writing. We do know he's trying and he is getting better. And there are things that we would probably love to see now that Brandon's not ready to do, but he is working towards it. But a critique doesn't necessarily mean that we are demanding anything. We are more trying to talk about what we would like to see potentially in the future if we can't see it now. But like us saying that we'd like to see something more from the author doesn't mean that we're saying Brandon is a bad person or necessarily that he's doing badly. Maybe there are other authors who are very specifically not including queer representation. And in those cases, like there is a lot more critique of the author and their choices, whereas like Brandon has openly talked about that he's not comfortable writing certain sexualities right now. He just couldn't get it to fit, but he's going to continue to work on it. And like we've brought up, he is a straight man and he does have fairly religious beliefs, and he does do quite well to think outside that so that he can include this queer representation. But I just wanted to put in a little PSA that like just because we're critiquing Brandon now doesn't mean that we're criticizing.
Also, if like Brandon making things more explicit in his current work, this is kind of becoming necessary, because even now you will have people who will say, no, there's no proof in canon that Shallan is bisexual. You will still have people who say like, oh, it's just Vale that's bisexual. It's not Shallan.
Oh,
or like if Brandon said it in the world of Brandon, that's not canon. You know, so it's nice to have more characters who are like ideally you wouldn't like say like, have I mentioned I am homosexual today? But you kind of
it's like Shallan's not going to go make out with a girl in the series. Like that's just not going to happen. And like there is such a high bar sometimes to prove that a character is gay, even when the author has specifically said, no, this is meant to be proof that Shallan is bisexual. Like the scene in Rhythm of War is Shallan being bisexual, and people still don't accept it because it's not explicit enough.
Just want like it's kind of this weird tension between we shouldn't have to prove it, but God, wouldn't it be nice if it was more explicit? Yeah. Right? Like we shouldn't have to defend it and like list out all the points of, and this is why we can say for canon, they're gay, they're bi. It's really hard having those conversations. It sucks. But also like maybe Brandon, please, a little bit more.
Yeah. It's kind of like people are sometimes joking about this conversation about Drehi in World of Radiance or Oathbringer? In one of those books, there's this conversation that basically boils down to everybody saying that Drehi is gay several times in different ways.
Yeah.
Mostly to Kaladin. And, you know, it kind of sounds funny. And I've seen people online meme about how, like, you know, Brandon will write those subtle clues of, like, this accidental homoromanticism, which I think we discussed back when you did the episode about Brandon tropes. And then when it comes to writing an actually homosexual character, it's have I mentioned I am homosexual today?
Yeah. And
Hit you over the head with it.
there's a writerly reason for that. Like, one of the issues Brandon as a writer and lots of writers run into, and these are two great examples of this with Shallan and Drahe. Shallan, I think Brandon is doing a good thing by trying to show, not tell, right? Like, that's good writing technique, is to show the reader things, not tell them. And so he's showing Shallan is attracted to women. How she perceives women is very visual and appreciative, and very vibrant. But because he's showing, not telling, people who are looking only, who are reading from a strictly heterosexual lens, are saying, no, you need to tell me, or I will not accept what you're showing me. Or not accept, but not.
I would say accept. Actually,
or not not acknowledge, because
not pick up
it's
on
like
it
it's
even.
almost like they're reading. Yeah, it's like you're wearing like rose-colored glasses, or not straight-colored glasses.
You
And so what's being shown, it's getting lost in translation. With Drahe, I think has the opposite problem. Brandon has, he's set in Wobbs, he's based on My Gay Friend. He has the scene in there where they're like, oh, Drahe's gay, he has a partner. But he hasn't shown Drahe being gay at all. Like, nothing. And part of this is because Drahe's a more minor character. He's not a viewpoint character. But we haven't seen him and his partner together at all. Other than like this kind of awkward conversation where they kind of deal with not homophobia, but kind of show that same-sex relationships aren't the default, and there's still a little awkwardness around them, even though Bridge 4 is very accepting. His queerness hasn't really made a difference to him as a character, and nothing about him is marked. He's like kind of missing all the subtext that we're reading into canonically straight characters like Adolin and Kaladin and Vin and Shan or whoever, right? We're reading all the subtext in, and Drahe is canon with no subtext.
Ooh, that's actually a super good point, is that Brandon, when he's writing an identity on purpose, there's no the subtext is all wrong for whatever he tries to do. If he assumes there's a straight character from Brandon assuming this character's straight, the subtext for straightness isn't there, so we read them as queer. I actually noticed this super much in Rhythm of War with Jasnah versus Venli. Venli read as incredibly asexual to me. She is not canonly asexual. Brennan has not said it. There's been no sort of like extra things in the text to actually lead this way. She just reads as very ace. Jasnah is the canon ace, and she does not read that way to me at all. The subtext is totally missing. It's totally wrong.
Could you also go into a little bit what ace means, Shannon?
Yes. And asexual, asexual, that's what it stands for. It means having no sexual attraction to people. It doesn't mean having no libido. For some asexual people, it can mean having no libido, but for a lot of people, it's not really relevant. You can have a sex drive, but not really feel that in relation to other people. Now, that's what sort of got me about Venli. She had that one conversation with her mother, I think, in the flashback, where they were talking about her future relationships, and her mother was like, "Oh, you'll understand when you're older," and Venli's like, "No, I don't feel anything like that, and I'm never going to." And I'm like, "Yes, that's what it's like. It's like it's about people telling you you're going to feel differently someday, and you just grow up and you grow up and you grow up and you never do." And then Jasnah, she's theoretically asexual, theoretically. And Brandon has this line where he tells but doesn't show. He's like, and Jasnah had never felt this way before. I should find the text because this is like, I really want to get the quote right here. Okay, here's the quotes. I'm not going to read every single bit, every paragraph, but just like interesting snippets I'm going to read interesting snippets of the quotes. He grinned, then kissed her hand again. He seemed to think that sort of thing would eventually spark passion in her. when in truth, physical stimulation was so inferior to mental stimulation. She came to realize early in her youth that she didn't approach relationships the same way everyone else seemed to. Her partners in the past had always complained that she was too cold, so academic. That had frustrated her. How was she to learn what others felt if she couldn't ask them? Most women, she suspected, would find him physically attractive. Okay. There is so much going on here. And this does not really read as an asexual woman to me at all. People who are ace can recognize that other people are attractive. I think lots of people are attractive, but I'm not attracted to them. It's a little subtle, but there is a huge difference in the experience of this. Asexual people are not cold and withdrawn from their partners. Asexual people can still feel romantic attraction, romantic feelings. In my introduction, I said I was biromantic asexual. I can feel romantic feelings, but I don't feel sexual feelings. That's kind of like the biggest difference. You'll notice for a lot of people who are either asexual or aromantic, we use this split attraction model where we can feel one or the other, or sometimes neither. That they're called, we call them aro aces. Very cute. This scene where Jasnah is heteroromantic, supposedly attracted to men, and doesn't feel ace feelings. This does not read as a woman who is in love with Hoid or has feelings for Hoid. She's described as being cold. She describes mental stimulation, which isn't really anything. That's like sapiosexuality, which is like a joke. It's kind of a meme. There is not a lot here in these selected quotes that actually reads as someone with romantic attraction, but who is asexual.
Yeah, and I think that is part of my issues with the scene as well. Knowing, like, I think there's a lot in the overall just sort of framing and writing of the scene that I don't love, but I think it really comes down to a lot of the fact of like, I don't get a romantic relationship vibe from Hoid and Jasnah. And if that's what's supposed to be happening here, it kind of throws the rest of the framing out of whack, because, you know, if we have this setup of Jasnah as a canon ace character who is not sex repulsed, who's, you know, willing to sleep with a partner she cares about, even if she herself is not interested in. If you don't sell the romantic aspect of that, you're kind of left with this question of like, if Jasnah's not in love with Hoid, which I don't get the sense that she's in love with Hoid in this, why is she sleeping with him? You know, like, Jasnah in this scene reads way more like someone who is aromantic to me, but maybe heterosexual in terms of like willing to sleep with someone, which isn't how she describes it in her head, but this idea of like, oh, I'm not really in love with him, but I'm willing to, you know, do this sort of thing. It's almost like it feels backwards, and the whole scene just kind of doesn't work for me in that way.
Fully agree.
It's really interesting to me, and I think this ties back to what we were saying before about Brandon's writing of subtext versus his queer characters, as there were so many fans who have thought for a very long time that Jasnah was ace or lesbian, and that was all through subtext in the first 3 books. Yet, like, the scene with Hoid doesn't have that subtext there. And it feels not necessarily forced, but like Brandon is trying really hard to put this at the forefront, but has dropped all of the subtext clues that people were looking at before as what could make Jasnah ace.
And I think the interesting dilemma that Brandon finds himself in, again, is this tension between showing and telling. And I think he knew going into this scene that he needed to tell the audience that Jasnah was ace, or her relationship with Hoid would completely overshadow what he intended for her identity to some readers. Like he does have her, appreciating his nose and his proportions, and that she finds his mind and banter fascinating. But I agree with you. It doesn't have the warmth of, relationships like Shallan and Adolin, and, well, honestly, I'm biased, but Adolin and anyone. Like, Adolin is a character that has so much warmth that he injects a lot into any of his scenes. And Jasnah is not as warm a character. So I think showing romantic appreciation is ironically maybe very difficult from her viewpoint, which is kind of further supporting the conclusion that she might be aromantic. I also wonder if part of it is, again, Brandon wanting to be explicit, but because of his kind of fade to black approach, being uncomfortable with kind of discussing sexuality too explicitly, or wanting to avoid, maybe even if he's comfortable, wanting to avoid it because he knows he's set up certain expectations for his readers on the kind of content in his books. So when he's saying things like physical attraction, I think what he's intending to say to confirm her ace identity is to say most women she suspected would want to have sex with Hoid, and she doesn't, right? But instead she's saying physically attractive. And so I think
I get what you're saying. Yeah,
I know. I agree with you that this scene, there's something off about it, and I think it's that tension between showing and telling, and that the writer wants to show more, but there's other kind of extra textual reasons to tell in this instance. And then the clash also between the telling and Brandon's style. And all of that kind of comes together to make the scene just not quite fit together.
So there's also something that struck me as I listened to the quote, is that Brandon is having a scene where Hoid and Jasnah are together and they're supposed to be having this interaction, and Hoid is, having the interaction, and meanwhile Jasnah is flashbacking to the times in her youth. So she comes across like she's completely distracted and completely not interested in what he's doing right now. Because, just lay back and think about all those times in your past.
Lay down and think about the church.
Oh boy. Yeah.
It does make me wonder if, because I really feel, just from what we've talked about here, people are going to continue to headcanon Jasnah probably as aromantic as well going forward, just from this scene. And it does make me wonder whether Brandon is trying to leave that open to himself. So when he does get to Jasnah's book, maybe she has decided that actually she's not, like, she doesn't have those romantic feelings towards other people in the same way that someone who is heteroromantic or homoromantic would, and her sexuality could evolve in that way, but he's just maybe not quite at the point where he feels like he could write. And I think this is what he was saying when he tried to make her a lesbian and it didn't work. He's just not at the point where he could write a character and give her justice of doing it correctly. So I do wonder if maybe she might end up as like Arrow Ace in the future. And maybe there's also plot reasons that she needs to be with Hoid. Personally, I think they could just be real good friends. And the same thing could probably happen. But yeah.
I will say I wouldn't base that entire theory on one word, but one word that does support it is in his wob, where the annotation where he said Jasnah's ace. Brandon did say that she is currently asexual.
Mm-hmm.
So that there was that he did say currently. So I don't know.
I think it was currently heteroromantic.
Yeah,
not asexual, but it's a good point.
It was currently heteroromantic.
Mm-hmm. I've kind of long wondered if this is maybe a an aspect of a version of Jasnah from a long time ago. And I will be very vague around spoilers, but mostly because I haven't actually read Way of King's Prime. But Jasnah does have a relationship with a man in that book I'm aware of. Won't talk any more detail, but I almost wonder if that is sort of like this was a part of what Brandon envisioned for Jasnah early on, even if it doesn't necessarily feel like it still meshes with the version of the character that we have gotten in canon. Because like looking at the sort of fandom history around Jasnah, she, I would say almost like above any other character, people were very sure that she was, you know, either lesbian or asexual, in a way that like the one thing we all thought we knew about Jasnah was that she didn't like men at all. Maybe she likes women, maybe she's not interested in anybody, but she definitely, for sure, totally confirmed she doesn't like men. And it was a little weird for that part of the fandom to get this version of Jasnah that has the sort of hetero-romantic and being entangled with Hoid sort of a vibe. And, you know, we could talk for ages about why that is. I think the scene that stands out to a lot of people in particular is the beginning of Words of Radiance when she's talking to Shallan about being betrothed. And Jasnah is so weirded out by the fact that Shallan isn't upset about this. Like, there's the one quote in particular that everyone pulls is Jasnah says, and I'm not looking at it, so I might get the phrasing wrong, but I'll be close, I promise.
Okay, so I do have the exact quote that everyone bases the dislike of men from the first chapter of Words of Radiance. "It doesn't bother you at all," Jasnah said. "The idea of being beholden to another, particularly a man? It's not like I'm being sold into slavery," Shallan said with a laugh. "No, I suppose not." Jasnah shook herself, her poise returning.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, it's very easy to point to that particularly a man bit and be like, look, proof, Jasnah said it. Which
the shaking herself, like, so like,
yeah, I think if you're at all curious about like why do people read Jasnah's queer, read that whole scene and look at the way that Jasnah acts. She is so uncomfortable around the topic in a way that we haven't ever really seen her be uncomfortable. And I know when I was doing some analysis on this scene, I talked about, you know, going back to sort of evidence for versus consistent with, you almost get, it's possible to read that scene as like Jasnah as a queer woman who doesn't like men, finding Shallan, who's a bi woman who is not opposed to the idea of liking men, and almost like Jasnah pinged that Shallan was also queer, but is now very confused why her queer friend is not weirded out by the idea of like marrying a man. Which obviously that's not what Brandon intended for that scene, but it parses very, very well. And I think for a lot of people who are already sort of in the headspace of Jasnah gives off very queer energy, that scene feels a lot like it could be proof. You know, talking about, I don't want to totally get into all of the Jasnah stuff because we are going to do a Jasnah specific podcast and we'll save some of that. But, you know, even from the very first time that Jasnah is introduced, before Shallan even meets with her, we find out like she's fairly old to be unmarried, and that's kind of weird. And she's like a very powerful woman who would be very desirable. Why isn't she married? And then Shallan meets her and she's like, oh my goodness, she's gorgeous. I thought she was going to be ugly and mean, because that was the only reason why she doesn't have a husband, right? And even just those little questions, the reader is thinking, why doesn't this very beautiful, very intelligent princess have a husband? Maybe she doesn't want one. Like, Brandon probably did not intend that to be the takeaway, but from the start, the way that Jasnah is introduced leads itself to these questions. And I think there is a very big part of the fandom that latched onto that interpretation and read her that way for books and books and books and years. So,
and I think this is where lens becomes very important, because like this scene that we're taught, like my mind's going crazy because there's so many like queer archetypes that Jasnah and Shallan fit with this scene, you know, like you've got the like experienced, like bitter older queer person and like the baby bisexual, like it's playing into a
Shallan,
lot
you
of
mean?
tropes that maybe general audiences aren't alive to, but a queer person is picking up on these tropes and it's screaming at you like it is canon. But if you're not aware of that and you're writing it accidentally, it's a little different. And the other thing I think is thinking a bit about Brandon's lens. And like Alyx said, Brandon, like Jasnah is a very old character in Brandon's mind. Like she's been around for a long time, not always in her current form. So Brandon has all this subtext and background information that the reader isn't getting. And so when we're picking up on all this subtext, Brandon is picking up on who knows what else is in his head about Jasnah, right? So it makes sense that he's not necessarily reading the scene in the same way that we are.
It's also right at the beginning of the book as well.
Yeah.
Like if it was maybe halfway through the book, it'd be like, okay, cool. Like we've had so much and then there's a new character. So maybe like first time I read Way of Kings, there was just so much going on and so many characters that people really got drowned out. But I'm pretty sure it's chapter 5 that Shallan first meets Jasnah. So it's just right
Early,
there
yeah.
at the beginning. And if you're looking for that like queer coding, that subtext, you've got it from the beginning. And I feel like people are going to notice that and just run with it the whole time. And like that's going to stick in their minds.
And I do want to add, this is a little bit meta, but it is part of the conversation. We've had sort of this idea about Jasnah since Way of Kings, and then the beginning of Words of Radiance was 2014. That's about 7 years ago now. I realized I was about to say 6. Oops, it's 7.
Yep.
Time passes, and Brandon did not say anything confirm her sexuality.
Yeah.
In 7 years. Might be
Yeah,
6.
he specifically
6.
avoided it as well. Like there's multiple WOBs where people asked and he went the ambiguous route, saying that she didn't want to be defined by her sexuality, which really fueled a lot of headcanons. It's
Brandon
like, well, if
may
you're not
not
gonna
have-
say it, then obviously like there's something there and you just don't want to confirm it at the moment.
That's exactly it. I think Brandon probably didn't realize that lack of answer is going to be taken as a confirmation. So when we got that chapter 17 annotation, currently heteroromantic asexual, that was the first time he's ever done that, and it was about 6-7 years after the fact. I just want to be very clear that this wasn't a theory or a hope that people had. People weren't hoping that Jasnah was going to be a lesbian. People thought Jasnah was a lesbian. It was more than any other character. Her sexuality, I think she's the only one where Brennan has so explicitly refused to say anything up until that annotation before.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't that like, oh, we were projecting and what we hoped would happen didn't happen. It was no, we thought this was in the bag and we had something taken away. Wow.
And even when that chapter 17 dropped in Rhythm of War, before the annotation came out, there were so many like memes that were going on about that line where people are theorizing if like Wit and Jasnah are together, and people really thought it was this massive red herring and like went on massive jokes with it. And then the annotation dropped and it was like having the carpet pulled out from under you.
Really thought it was a joke.
I still remember reading like a Tumblr post from around the time when the previews were coming out, and someone just wrote in like all capital letters, "Brandon, so help me God, this better be a misdirection or else."
Yeah. And I don't mean to say like, I know there are people for whom, you know, Jasnah being confirmed ace and heteroromantic was something that they thought was really good, that they liked, especially because it came out before we actually got to read the Wit Jasnah scene, which people might have had problems with later on. And we don't mean to say that, like, if you thought that was a really good thing and you were excited about it, that you're wrong and actually it was bad and you should have thought that it sucked. This is, we talk from our own perspectives. We all have our own ways that we reacted to it. We're not trying to invalidate anyone who actually really liked the things that Brandon said about how it was confirmed and things like that. Please know that that is a totally valid opinion to have, even if, some of us disagree. It's not wrong to disagree with our takes.
I think our purpose is to use that distinction as an example, not to say our way of reading this is the only right way, because really our point is there's multiple ways to read it, and
they're not mutually exclusive either. Like, these different views can exist at the same time, but hopefully this is giving a bit of a look into a different viewpoint that some people might not have thought about. But that, it doesn't mean other viewpoints aren't anywhere as legitimate.
Yeah.
I liked, when Brandon first said it, I was like, oh, my main headcanon for her had always been asexual. And so I was like, oh, I got that. Amazing. We have a rep. And I partied about it. And I did not mind hetero-romantic at all, because even in the queer community, there tends to be a lot of people who are like, oh, hetero-romantic people are just straight, basically. And they don't always get acknowledged. And so I was like, okay, I'm totally fine having rep. That needs rep too. And then we got to the chapter and I was like, this is the extent of her being this is what you call hetero-romantic ace? Brandon,
Yeah.
You tried.
Yeah. There was an attempt. There was an attempt.
I don't disagree
And
with
he's
the
trying,
concept,
and I think that is
Yes.
worth acknowledging. Like, this is his first time really trying to, I think it's his first time, like, really trying to do a ace character as a prominent major character. So,
and from their viewpoint,
from their viewpoint.
other than and Shallan, he kind of got spoiled because he wrote her as bi accidentally, and then he didn't have to
Shallan
think,
doesn't
okay,
count.
how am I going to write Shallan bi? Because he's like, okay, I just have to keep writing Shallan as she is, and she will be bisexual.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas, Jasnah hasn't had as many viewpoints. She's never been in like a romantic or intimate situation really from her perspective yet. So I think there was a bit more thought and more kind of competing things going in. And I think that for me personally, what I find frustrating, not with Brandon, just with the situation, is that I totally get where he's coming from, that he's like, oh, I'm not ready. I need to research more. I really want to get this right before I have like major viewpoint queer characters. But then you look at like some of the Adolin and Kadie scenes, for example, and you're just like, here's two male characters who have tons of chemistry. One of my fave recent ones is read chapter 12 of Rhythm of War.
So sweet.
But there's a lot of other excellent, and again, Kaladin and Adolin fit into a lot of queer MLM. MLM is men who love men. And so the reason why I use that term is because it can refer to both gay men or ace men who have romantic attraction to other men, or bisexual men. But it fits into a lot of MLM tropes, like their initial rivalry, to mutual respect, to best friendship, to deep emotional support for one another. It's fitting a lot of those like romantic well, even like straight romance novels. Like there's many a Jane Austen book that follows that exact trajectory.
Adolin, Pride and Prejudice AU. That would be fun.
Great.
It feels like a long burn fan fiction. So like a romance that is really drawn out over like a massive amount of time, and like you're just rooting for it to like continue on because you just want to see them get together in the end. And that's what it feels like. I agree with everything you're saying.
Yeah, Kadolin was like made to write fanfic about. Like their dynamic is just like, there's a reason why I think a lot of fan fiction is inspired, because it's so well set up. And so like I'm looking at this and I'm like, Brandon, like you can write a queer character. I think maybe just don't think about it too much, and try to tap into what you're already doing unintentionally.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the meme of the Cosmere fandom, is that a lot of times the characters that Brandon doesn't mean to be in a romantic relationship seem to have more romantic chemistry than the canon couples. And yeah, I mean, it happens a lot.
Kaladin and Adolin, they admire each other, and they talk in like their own narrative and thoughts about how much they admire each other, or think that the other person looks cool, or want emotional thoughts about the other person. This happened in Oathbringer and Rhythm of War, where they were finally at that level where they were talking about, oh man, I want to support Adolin, or oh man, I want to support Kaladin. It was like this back and forth. What other relationship in all of Stormlight gets to this level of like characters actually thinking about each other? It doesn't happen. Brandon doesn't do this, except for these two.
Well,
they even have like cutesy nicknames for one another, like Bridge Boy and Princeling.
Right. They're very cute.
That start as insults, but then become terms of endearment.
Yeah. It reminds me, just to cross universes very quickly, it reminds me of Spencer and Jorgen in Skyward, and like how she calls him Jerkspace, and it starts as like an aggressive nickname and like turns into such a term of endearment. So yeah, it just reminds me of that.
And that's a really good example, because in the first Skyward book, I don't think anyone would blink an eye about theorizing along the way that there's something maybe romantic between Spencer and Jorgen. Like I think if someone reading the first book was like, there's tension here and I ship them or whatever, like...
Sorry. That was me. Sorry. I was just like, that was me.
I thought you were signaling me to like stop talking.
No, that was me. I was like, I see this chemistry, Brandon.
Yeah. And I don't think most readers would like object to that, and they'd be like, oh yeah, sure, I see it. But if it's a queer relationship, you're more likely to, I guess, like see some blowback. And the other thing I want to touch on with Adolin and Kaladin is the common point that gets brought up as well. But Adolin's a ladies' man. But again, we're not shown that Adolin is a ladies' man. We are told he is a ladies' man. What we're shown is Adolin has many failed relationships with women that don't work out, and he seems to lose interest very quickly. So again, like a person who's approaching it from one lens would see that, oh, he's a typical ladies guy. He doesn't get attached. He keeps it casual. Reading it from a queer lens, you might say he's not finding fulfillment in many of his opposite sex relationships he's entering into, and then spends a lot of time thinking about this tall and stoic bridge boy, who also happens to conversely think about Adolin. And we were talking before about Kaladin being kind of AC, or like kind of sex neutral, almost repressed. And yet he's always thinking about, oh, how does he get his hair to fall so messily and perfect?
That's so true. There's definitely a quote where like Shallan thinks this about Adolin, about like his hair is messy in just the right way. And then it feels like, oh, I wish I knew where they were better. But there's definitely a time when Kaladin does it in almost the exact same way of talking about how messy and attractive Adolin's hair is. It's like, I don't know that was intentional, but it happened.
Yeah. And I think this is how the Jasnah Shallan thing started too, is Brandon, I don't know, like I think it's starting as like writing envy or like appreciation for the character, but just it reads very
admiration, like interest even.
Yeah, like Jasnah has been a popular ship since we just had Way of Kings. It was one of the sort of like big ships in the fandom, I would say. But I would say like it's not even just Jasnah that Shallan expresses this toward. Like there's a quote where she talks about how pretty Beryl is in Rhythm of War, and it's like, oh yeah, this is kind of just how Shallan is very appreciative of how pretty other women are, and that definitely feels like it.
I have a quote as well.
Oh,
yeah, go for
it. This one really stood out on one of my rereads of Oathbringer, and I was like, oh, like, and this was after all the stuff on Twitter where Brandon's like, oh, actually, yeah, she kind of is bisexual. So this really stood out to me. In Oathbringer, Shallan is talking to Kaladin in Shadesmar, and they're on the boat talking about the Spren and how they're not really curious about watching them. Kaladin goes, I'd have expected them to watch us a little more than they do. They don't seem that curious about us. Which is odd, considering how interesting Azure is. Wait, just Azure? Yes.
Yeah.
In that polished breastplate and striking figure, with her talk of chasing bounties and traveling the wilds, she's deeply mysterious. And I can't not read that and be like, oh, Shallan, your gayness is showing. And I love it.
the attraction to women is,
yeah, like this is kind of the subtle stuff that I don't even know if Brandon meant that, but it comes across to me in the same way that her talking about Jasnah comes across.
Yeah, it reads as like, oh, I've had the same experience as this, and when I did it, it was gay.
Yeah, like I know so many people, including myself, who went through I'm not attracted to women. I just think they're really pretty. And then you get to the point that you're like, oh, wait.
Oh, wait a second.
Hang on, let's stop and think about this.
I
and
only
that's how
stare
Shallan
at men's
reads.
abs because I want abs.
Yeah. I almost wonder, like, Brandon has talked a little bit when we talk about the Rhythm of War quote about how, like, Shallan might not fully be at the point where she's willing to, accept that this is the way that she feels, whereas Vale is more comfortable with it. But I almost wonder if this is sort of like an expression of this, like, Adolin is here and they're betrothed. And I almost wonder if Shallan thinks like, oh, well, I can't talk about finding men attractive because my fiance is around, but it's fine to talk about how attractive the women are around me because I'm straight. It doesn't mean anything, right?
She might also just feel more comfortable now where it's like, okay, I have that safety and security of if things fail, I'm not alone. I'm not like miserable. I can start creeping out a little bit and exploring this other part of me because I have that support system I didn't have before.
Yeah.
I think going from, not that we only want to talk about Jasnah and Adolin as the only, extra canonical queer ships out there, because there's lots of them. I mean, Moash has an obsession with Kaladin that some people definitely like to read as romantic. Moash is a very popular ship. It's twisted and in a weird, dark, bad place right now, but you can read that. The whole like quote about, Moash says, I'm unchained. And Odin's like, no, you're not. And he's like, okay, I have one chain. And it's Kaladin.
Mostly unchained.
Mostly unchained. Fair if you want to read it. Absolutely.
Oh man, Rhythm of War was great. There was that quote. There was Navani Raboniel, which was super queer. Like
Amazing.
They hold hands and sing, and Raboniel is like the one person in the whole book, the first time in canon who like looks at Navani and is like, yes, you're worthy, you're a scientist, and like validates all of Navani's like fears and doubts about herself.
Gives her a title.
Gives her a
singer title.
Yeah.
Especially narratively speaking, like how the prologue for that book sets up Navani's big conflict as not being recognized and not being her own person, and being like, oh, and she's still kind of struggling with that with Dalinar, because like Dalinar is someone who kind of shapes everyone.
He's overbearing
around him, right?
We love him. Yeah,
we love him, but he's a magnetic. Well, and this is critique. Like Adolin comments on this. Jasnah does. Navani does. Like Dalinar just kind of.
Yeah, this is actually perfect writing by Brandon. This is characterization.
Yeah.
You know, Dalinar is not the kind of person who he's not. I don't know if he's capable of seeing this about Navani yet. It's exactly right. The bad romantic partner in the beginning is like, oh, Navani, you suck. You're bad. You're a bad scientist. And then later, we kind of skip over Dalinar, and then we go to Raboniel, who's like, oh, Navani, you're great.
I have a Tumblr post that I would quite like to read that like is very similar to what Shannon said before, but I think it like encapsulates it so well. It's by Tumblr user Rlain, I think it's pronounced.
Sure,
but
or Rlain.
Or Rlain. That's probably more closer
wow, that
to
probably is what that username is. I never put that together. Wow.
Oh, you guys. Killing me.
Rlain. Okay, anyway, sorry.
Navani and Raboniel really held hands and sang together and invented something entirely new and beautiful and powerful and proved that their peoples were not naturally opposites destined to destroy each other. I need a minute. And like I think that like covers it pretty well. Like reading those scenes to me, I was like, wow, if you change like a little bit here, add a little bit there, maybe add in like one more scene or so, you've got a giant love story right there. Like the fan fiction writes itself.
Yeah. And I do want to say something. I think a common critique I see about headcanons and shipping, particularly queer ships, is, well, like, what about representation of deep platonic bonds that we don't get a lot of? And it's like, you know what? Brandon is actually really great at writing deep platonic bonds, as you can see. But the thing is, we don't actually need more representation of that because we're getting a lot of it. And so that might be a problem if every single queer ship we were talking about was actually canon. But the reverse is canon. True. Very few of them are, or most of the ones we've talked about so far are not. So we'd be having a different conversation maybe if all of these were canon and we were having actually no examples of deep platonic connection. But right now we have a wealth of deep platonic connection, and
it shouldn't
so it's fun to imagine
bother
a little more romantic.
Yeah, it's like it doesn't hurt anything. It doesn't actually take away any of the platonic relationships that exist in canon to imagine it romantic with kissing.
I think the other thing with the platonic relationships is something that fiction in general, like media in general, I think needs more of is like the male-female friendships that are just platonic.
Yes.
And just to touch back quickly on Jasnah Wit, like I think that was a really good place that Brandon could have had like a deep platonic male-female friendship. And it's not really there. So like I guess that is a bit of a frustration to me because yes, we have all of these deep platonic friendships and it's really good to have them between male and male characters, female and female characters, but also we need them more as well from male female characters. So I feel like it's justified for people to see there be more of a romantic relationship between these queer characters because that's what's lacking on that side. And if there was more of the balance with heterosexual friendships as well, then that would probably balance things out a lot more.
Yeah. I know when I find a book that does a male-female deep friendship, non-romantic, very well, especially if the characters are straight and that's not ever like brought into like, no, they're straight, they just don't feel that way about each other. That is a selling point for a good book for me. And I will like tell people, hey, this book does this really well, you should read it because it's great. And it is really rare in a lot of cases. And people default assume.
It's not a book, but something that I've definitely, like a movie I've seen, which I actually think is a very bad movie. The Kissing Booth, I think actually has one of the best male-female friendships that I've seen in media. which was just really refreshing. I hated the rest of the movie, but I really liked that bit.
Priory of the Orange Tree came to mind for me for having two great friendships like this.
It's on my bookshelf. Not that one.
Cosmere example, one I think that's developing or heading this way potentially is Wax and Marasi. Because you can tell, like, you know, there's some growing respect and camaraderie there. And they had their kind of initial, like, will they, won't they arc in book one that was quickly discarded. And I was happy to see that. But I don't think he's quite gotten to the level of, like, showing the deep connections he's shown in Navani Raboniel or Adolin Kaladin, Moash.
Maybe just Wax and Wayne.
Or Wax and Wayne, yeah. No, great. Yeah. Great example. Or even it's a little different because there's kind of a parental element to it. Kelsier and Vin is probably one of the deepest non-romantic male-female relationships.
Yeah.
Other than, like, actual familial ones.
Yeah, there is also, like, Kaladin and Shallan, and even they had, like, one whole book of just this will they, won't they love trianglism.
And I feel like what they were looking for the entire time was just, like, friendship, and they got there in the end.
What's that one quote?
The feeling was friendship. Neither of them had ever experienced it before.
I'm having feelings for you. And then the narrator voice, that feeling was friendship. They've never experienced it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a great meme.
I will say, while we have brought up Mistborn Era 2 things, we do have to mention that Ranette exists, but unfortunately, I don't think there's much more that we can mention about Ranette other than that she exists.
I have a question. Where do we get her partner's name? Is Mizra like mentioned in the book, or is that from a wob?
Shadows of Self?
In the book. Okay. I think I like vaguely remember in Shadows of Self he mentions Mizra.
Okay, good.
I'm not that far yet in that case.
I think she says something along the lines of, like, oh, like, Misra would kill me for getting involved in this, or, like, or I would do this, or but I can't because Misra would kill me, or something like that.
I have the quote if you want it. Yeah, it just, and Misra would shoot me if I did help you, more or less.
Yeah. We just, Ranette is in a handful of scenes and is not a very significant part of any of them. Like, she's good at guns. She's mean to Wayne.
The guns for the gangs. Yeah, she provides the guns for the gangs.
Don't even remember that. She's there. She exists. She's gay. That's it.
And it's largely, like, those scenes are largely taken up from, like, Wayne not hitting on her. So it really kind of overshadows pretty much everything else. And I would say most of Ranette's character is actually Wayne, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
She's not even mean. You know what? She's not even mean to Wayne. She's not even mean.
No.
Wayne is inappropriate to her, and
valid.
she reacts politely and then more and more firmly until he gets the message. You know what? Like, she is not mean to Wayne. I'm gonna take that away. Strike that off her character list. No.
I think and Ranette, it's kind of the same similar thing with Drahe, and one of the things you run into with Rep and side characters is things are always presented from the main characters, the viewpoint character's perspective. So you automatically run into that feeling where they're being experienced not from their own experience, but the role they're playing in the viewpoint character. So Ranette, I think, falls into a device to show that Wayne is oblivious, right? Like, more so than, and, Drahe at times can come across as a device, like in that one scene where they're discussing his sexuality. It's almost like the point is more to show that Kaladin isn't, like, perfect, and he can be a little awkward around certain issues. Which does not help against the reading that Kaladin is a repressed gay.
Yeah.
The awkwardness of how he handles that scene.
it also feels like this is Brandon's attempt to write queerness into the background of the stories as well. And it seems a little bit overhandled to me, instead of just having small observations of noticing characters in the background talking to like wife and wife or husband and husband. And it's something that would be nice to see more of that. Like the queer characters are not necessarily just the ones that have names.
Yeah, it's something that honestly kind of frustrates me about Brandon's world building, well, like one aspect of it, because we have like this big world of Brandon about how homosexuality is treated in different places around the Cosmere. And one point he makes there is that Vorinism has specific oaths for partnership or marriage. He doesn't really specify it, I don't think, for same-sex couples. But then we get to like actually be in the books, and you will find very little evidence of that. Like we never clarify if, I don't think we ever clarify if Drew and Drehi are husband and husband, or are they just boyfriends? We don't. Yeah, and we never see like a scene like Dalinar walked into the room where General so-and-so was talking with his husband, or anything like that, or the two women holding hands together in a bar where Shallan is hanging out, or something like that. We have the word of Brandon that there is space in Vorinism for, for queerness, for being queer, but we never see it in the actual text of the book, even as like background mentions. And even more, when we have mentions of it, it's in the context of characters being awkward about it, like Kaladin being weird about like Drehi and his gayness, or that word of Brandon we have about Shallan maybe not necessarily being okay with being openly bisexual yet. It kind of, there's this dissonance where on one hand you have Brandon saying in a walk that Vorinism is okay with being queer, and on the other hand you have Vorin characters who are very uncomfortable and awkward around queerness. Mm-hmm. So this is something that just, we could use more background, like throwaway sentence representation.
Yeah. And it's not like we don't get that for the straight couples in the book. Like there's definitely been scenes where Brandon's like offhand mentioned like families or like husbands or wives just like in the war camps, and that could easily be a mention to a homosexual couple instead.
Yeah. And one way he has done this, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, is with the war pairs. Like he's mentioned, they're not all opposite gender war pairs, right? Or am I getting that wrong?
I don't remember it, but it's possible.
I don't recall. Yeah.
Now I'm beginning to wonder if I have it backwards.
I think a lot of them stay with their mate pair.
Yeah.
And that's how the war pairs are formed.
Yeah. But I think some of them, I was thinking some of them were the same gender, but now I'm thinking they initially thought they were all men, but then realized it was men and women, and they were just both in war form, so they looked more similar. But yeah.
I find these singers really interesting because they have this form that is mate form and the reproductive form, and Brandon's kind of talked about how in like technicality they all are kind of asexual when they're not in mate form. But then we were talking earlier about Venli as well, and how she really didn't want to be in mate form. And I think there's a nice duality there where it's like, okay, well, you can see all the singers as asexual, but there is also like still the flexibility and space for people who are singers to feel more asexual than like, I'm not in mate form, therefore I am not interested in sex. And it's like, no, I do not wish to do this at all. Like I have no desire and actively do not want to.
And then you have some listeners who are mentioned who stay in mate form almost all the time, right? Yeah. So like there's still a spectrum there, even though you could view it as kind of more cased or separated, but there's still a spectrum of how they interact.
Yeah. I like how Brandon has also started incorporating transgender people into the Cosmere as well. And
bring that up. Yep.
the big example is Ralnar, the Reshi king, and it comes up in Dawn Shard that Lopen, it's a Lopen POV, he describes the features of the Reshi king very differently to how Risen does in Words of Radiance when she meets the king. And that's really nice. And I thought that was, it's still a little bit like tell, not show, but I felt like it was a bit more show than some things. And it's good to see that representation also coming into the Cosmere as well.
Yeah, I really like that we are getting more. I hope that's something that Brandon continues to explore. We've had wobs about like the returned being, how a trans returned would, shift to match the presentation that they had in their head, and I love that we're getting to see that with the Radiance. I would be interested to see if we get anything along those lines with Leshwi, who we know is in, a melon body that's mentioned. That I think there is room for more exploration. I hope that's something Brandon continues to, adapt and go into as the series continues.
One popular trans headcanon I've sine that I obviously don't know if it'll play out is with Lift. I think a lot of people see her, trans people who I've read their stuff have related to, her feelings about discomfort with her body as it's aging. I think that's a fairly common trans experience, especially for trans men. And so, I don't know if that's what Brandon's intending with Lift, but it's another example of people resonating with, things they're seeing on the screen and certain subtext things that are really relevant to them. And then using headcanon to explore it.
And like the difficulty she had in Edge Dancer with dealing with her first period, the fact that she binds her breasts, like a lot of that reflects real life experiences.
Yeah.
I can say I can very much relate as someone who is assigned female at birth and doesn't quite mostly identifies as a girl, but definitely is not comfortable with her body. I can very much relate to all of basically everything Lift says, where she's like, why can't I just go back to being younger where I didn't have to deal with all this?
Yeah.
And it's like, I feel you, girl.
Yeah.
And I could pretty easily see her being non-binary or pretty much any flavor of trans. I could definitely see that.
Yeah, puberty sucks.
Yeah.
In so many ways. Puberty sucks. I think the other really interesting character that came up in Rhythm of War is the Sibling. And the fact that they use gender-neutral pronouns, they do not care at all about gender. And like Brandon uses they, them the entire way through. He doesn't explain it, he just does. And that was kind of nice because there was the scene where the Sibling and Navani are talking and the Sibling says, like, I don't care about gender, like it means nothing to me. But that doesn't happen at the beginning, and the Sibling doesn't have to explain the pronouns, which I really don't think the Sibling would care about at all. They're just there from the beginning, which was just refreshing.
Yeah.
One thing that annoyed me about that is that it's another element of another use example of not having a human non-binary character. And the Sibling explicitly calls gender a human thing, which I was like, oh, the human non-binary people in the audience reading this right now might be a little bit annoyed at that, maybe. That just really stood out to me as another, by calling gender a human thing and then by having another non-human reject gender, I think non-binary humans would certainly be something I would like to see.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be. It's common. This isn't just a Brandon problem. It's kind of all throughout science fiction fantasy land, is like having non-human, non-binary characters.
It's easier to make the alien non-binary than to explain the humans being non-binary.
Androids.
And there's lots of examples of this, like the Chandra could be read as, more transgressive or more, I guess,
gender fluid almost.
Yeah, or
gender
like more
neutral
interesting from a gender perspective. Or
Yeah.
have a more complex understanding of their gender. The listeners we've talked about, and now like the sibling and like Spren having multiple genders. Brandon has talked about that. And it's kind of this way of skirting around it where you don't need to write about the human experience of being in these different identities, because you can work that different experience into like these different culture or biology or makeup of these more alien creations.
Like Nightblood sometimes being referred to with feminine pronouns, because leaning into that, and it's kind of the same thing.
If we can hop out of the Cosmere for a moment again. Sorry, spoilers for Starsight right now, but even like in a sci-fi setting like Skyward and Starsight, you don't see any humans that go by day. But once we go into space, then there's entire species of Dione, however you write it, where every member is using they them pronouns
and have completely different gender like setups as well.
I feel like there's almost like a missed opportunity with the Ardentia. Like, what if every Arden was referred to as they, them? Because Vorinism does have this strict gender binary and gender roles, but you also have this, third area of people who are specifically supposed to be outside the gender binary. Yeah. I think we would see a lot of, if Brandon was writing non-binary characters in Vorinism who might feel comfortable in the Ardentia, but all of the Ardents that we've met are still using what we assume to be their assigned at birth pronouns. And it's, I feel like we would see things there. One of the few examples I can sort of think of is Jasnah's friend Yochi. I don't know how you actually pronounce that. Who is said to be, he's a baker, but he's also sort of secretly known as this, female scholar under a pen name. And that's a very sort of, I wish we got more time to experience who he is as a character. Does he have a non-standard gender identity, or is it just like, oh, I want to do scholarly things, and so I'm going to write under a female pen name? Like, I think that's a character that could have potential of that sort of gender queer headcanons. And
when you look at in our own history the number of women who have gone under male names and then finding like in evidence way later that some of them, not all of them, but some of them genuinely did like want to be treated with male pronouns all the time, not just as this is my way to get into being a doctor or something, but this feels more right. It's difficult to look back because they didn't use the same language. And I kind of think that's what Brennan is trying to play to, is that the word trans, the way that we use it, didn't exist and wouldn't necessarily exist. It's just trying to find the way to convey these things without using modern terminology. Really difficult. And I can kind of see that that's what he's going for. He wants it to feel genuine to the world, but also, it kind of is a little bit. Again, missed opportunity with the Ardentia for sure.
Yeah, particularly because like all the women don't wear safe hand gloves anymore.
I thought they did. They?
I think
no, they do. They're ungloved.
Was wearing a glove.
And
I thought the horse lady.
She's not an Ardent.
She's not an Ardent.
Oh, I thought she was.
And I think like horse training is something both can do without being Ardent.
Yeah, it's like that weird gray area.
Gotcha.
The Ardentia are really interesting, I think, because you totally see them as a spot where a lot of queer, both gender and sexuality people would end up. Because like they have this very gendered society, right, where same-sex partners, I think, would be disadvantaged because, like, if you're two men, you're hiring out to have a woman describe to you for you and to do things for you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're two women, you're potentially, you know, having to pay for something that an opposite sex couple is set up to succeed at on their own based on their strict gender divide. So I totally see the Ardentia as a place where people are like, oh, if I become an Ardent, I can do everything. And it doesn't matter that I'm a guy or a girl or in between, or that I'm attracted to same sex as myself or different, or like it's...
That definitely makes sense.
You're also kind of selling yourself into slavery to obtain that freedom, since all Ardents are owned by the crown.
It's a little weird. Definitely, as a queer reader, that makes sense of like you're in a rigid society looking for the in-between places. You know, there's the Ardents being the tailor-made in-between place for you.
Mm-hmm. I would love to see maybe more of this with like Rushu, how they've talked about, you know, Rushu is very pretty. She didn't like that, you know, men were really attracted to her. That you almost get the sense that Rushu feels more free as an Ardent with her head shaved and kind of being outside of the, like, almost off limits to the attraction of you know, the men around her. I would love to see more of that from like Rushu's character, of her being non-binary or something like that, and feeling comfort in the Ardentia because it is a more genderless place than, you know, the feminine Vorin gender roles sort of a vibe.
I just wanted to add, it feels almost weird to me that Vorinism, this religion that is really obsessed with what men and women can do, doesn't have a separate pronoun for the people who are outside of that binary, like the Ardents.
Yeah, it feels like in like spoken Alethi and the Vedin that you would have a third pronoun for Ardents, but nobody ever mentions that being the case.
No, that I definitely think that would make sense from a cultural linguistic perspective.
We know they have gendered first person pronouns because Dalinar and Navani talk about it, but other than that,
on the topic of both characters that use gender neutral pronouns, but also what we were talking about before, where they're non-humanoid characters as well. The Sleepless use it as a pronoun, which I think is a very interesting choice on Brandon's part, because depending who you talk to, it can come across very, very poorly, or there are people who do identify with it. So it was very interesting to read the Sleepless POVs where they were using that as their collective pronoun, because they do really see themselves as a giant horde, basically.
Yeah. Well, I've seen the it pronoun used very well. That's the murder bot, where they don't see themselves as being humans or being people. So like all like the robot AIs, they all use its as their pronouns. And I thought that was really, it was you can do it in a way that isn't insulting or I think you could do it well, and definitely really interesting. One thing I think Brandon did this, and I think it's a mistake, and it's also something that's way too late to change or fix, because it was written in from the first book of Stormlight, was the way listener gender works. One of those things you just start to think about, it's like, oh, there are basically like 2 male, 2 female genders, and the difference is whether they feel sexual attraction or not, or have a libido or not. And that's super weird, and I don't think that was really well considered. Gender and sexuality are 2 very different axes, and if your sexuality changes or alters, that doesn't affect the sense of who you are, like gender-wise. And it's one of those things, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, 2010, right? Was when it first came out?
I think it was Words of Radiance that we found out about the singer genders.
Okay, sure, yeah. So maybe up to 2013. Within the last 10 years, I can see this being maybe Brandon didn't really understand how this whole gender identity thing works and why. When you're cis and you've never really heard a trans person talk about it, I think it's easy to maybe make assumptions or take the wrong information from what you're being told. Cis just means that you feel the same gender as the one you were assigned when you were born. So the doctor looks at your genitals and says, "Oh, this one's a girl," and they base that on the genitals, and then you grow up and you feel like a girl. And then so that means you're cis. If it's that's the current language used. You might hear something different depending on the community that you're in. But that assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth is, and if you keep following with that as you grow up, you're cis. CIS, not SIS.
Mm-hmm.
Just in case you're confused.
Which is an actual affix that exists in other contexts too. So a lot of people think that people made it up wholesale, but no, it's
there's a lot of stuff in chemistry and biology that use cis and trans to describe things basically in the same way that we now use it for gender. It's just in a different context.
Same root. It's a science word, actually. Go figure.
Yep.
Yay, science.
Dim in the queer cast. Go figure.
Yeah. You can't stop Cosmere nerds from talking about terminology or linguistics.
We love it.
It's so interesting. It's going through both the discussion of the listeners and their different genders and the interesting relationship they have with their gender and being somewhat fluid. And also thinking back to the ardent conversation, I find Renarin and Rlain's trajectory very interesting because Renarin, who has recently been outed outside of canon as, having a crush on a guy, was routinely kind of being pushed towards the Ardentia by his family and kept, kind of considering it. And again, this is one of these things that I think as queer people or a queer reader might pick up on and be like, oh, this is the finding a place for the gay son who doesn't quite fit into the family dynasty. Which, so it made sense, I think, for a lot of people, for Renarin and Rlain, it kind of made sense. It was a natural progression. And what's interesting, I think, about this as an example is here's a place where subtext again, maybe was intentional. Brandon was intending to foreshadow this, but maybe came off stronger than he realized because he put the subtext in and then he said, oh, I think it should be fairly obvious. And then for people who don't know the story, it was on a stream. And then his assistant said, yeah, I think it's pretty obvious. And he's like, okay, yeah, so chat's probably right then. And he said, oh, yeah, but chat's guessing a bunch of different things. And then you look at the chat and it's Renarin and Rlain, Renarin and Rlain, Renarin and Rlain. So for me, at least, that moment was very validating because after having subtext about Adolin and Kaladin and being nope, Navani Raboniel, nope, it's oh, actually this time you weren't crazy.
Yeah,
this was intended to be here. And the foreshadowing with Rlain as well, having similar to what we discussed with Venley, an interesting relationship with the listener genders and not liking mate form.
Interested in mate form.
Yeah, explicitly so.
Going strange. Yeah. As someone, I'll say, as a connoisseur of Renarin ships throughout the years, if we ever do a fandom history podcast, I'll talk a lot about my Renarin ships. But I have definitely written Kaladin fanfics for a while, Kaladin being a very popular Renarin ship. But I know when we were reading Rhythm of War, and I've said this before in other places, but I also thought this was Brandon did it again. Here's a queer ship with chemistry that he's probably not ever going to act on. But I think it's like a really cute dynamic. And I was just shocked that this was actually a dynamic he was planning to explore. And I think it hopefully does have some potential, because it didn't start out with, and these are gay characters who are going to be gay now, in a way that we've gotten with a lot of the side characters. This did feel like a ship that arose sort of organically out of the text that people were seeing. And I mean, anything could happen in the future, but I have hopes that it will be good and be a well-realized relationship and things like that.
Yeah.
Well, do we have any other future hopes? Any other headcanons that we would love to explore further going forward? Anything else we want to see?
I admit this is like completely baseless, but I would love for the main character of the next Mistborn era to be bisexual, gay, lesbian, whichever gender Brandon ends up going with them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just non-straight, just the main character. Because even with like Renarin and Rlain are nice and they will be main characters, but Renarin was kind of stuck in this having a secret phase for the first 3 books, so he couldn't really be the point of view for a while.
His screen time was very limited.
So it would be nice to have a main character who is main point of view, who is actually queer.
I agree with you 100%. And I think also one of the issues I think modern writers have, or fantasy specifically has, depicting queer relationships, is because of the history in literature and some of the conventions that are around, and restrictions actually against, writing published works about queer relationships. The only examples we have of queer people in writing for certain periods in certain languages is subtextual. We don't have good examples of writing canonical, explicit queer relationships. And since the new Mistborn trilogy is going to be in a more modern setting, I think it's kind of 80s era technology. I'm hoping Brandon's comfort with depicting queer relationships or queer identities will be a little higher, because he won't have to worry about using terminology that feels wrong for the period.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I agree with you.
And now I'm just on board with that. I'm like, I didn't really have any hopes except for Rlain should be good. That's my hope. But now I'm like, oh yeah, let's
that's great.
Queer lady programmer. I think she's. I think so we've heard maybe possible Terrace woman is the lead. This is not confirmed.
Ooh.
This is just from like the wobs that we're hoping we get like a Terrace woman. Yeah, let's make her queer. Let's do it. Go, Brandon.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Now I'm into that. Okay.
And it fits really well because, like, I know it's just 80s level technology. We don't know it's going to be 80s era culture.
Yeah.
But like the 80s were also like a very like time for where like the queer movement was expanding a lot and gaining a lot of ground. And also the side, like he's kind of hinted, I don't know, the vibes I've been getting from some of the wobs is it might be a little cyberpunky, or he might work in some like, I don't know, maybe this is just me going off base, but it just feels
I see
like
where
there's
you got there.
A lot of gay potential with this next. I'll say that.
Something that I would really like is, because Brandon's doing this Mistborn screenplay, and if it goes anywhere, I know he's talked previously about how he kind of wishes he had made Ham and or Doxin female. I would actually really like if he took that a step further and had them as trans women instead of just gender swapping them. I think that the fact that he wants more female representation in Kelsey's crew anyway, I think this is a really good opportunity that he could explore a different view of womanhood.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then I would like to see more human characters who go by they, them.
Yes.
And,
Mhm.
maybe if we do have like a queer protagonist for the next Mistborn, then I would love for like a more robust romance between them. Like,
Yes.
Brandon is getting better at writing romances, but, it would be nice.
Kadie, do you have any future wishes?
This is more just a general wish for fantasy, but I hope we get non-binary characters who are non-binary, but aren't just like completely like I have no gender, I don't care about gender, but instead like have a gender or aligned toward something, but they're still definitely non-binary. I don't know. I would like seeing that, but it's a little more specific.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That would be a really cool concept. I know you don't always want to tie like a gender identity or a sexuality to like something special or something magic, because it kind of like exoticizes it, or like it's a regular thing that everyone has. And so you shouldn't need to be like a listener or a whatever, but a Lightweaver character who's like gender fluid or like not non-binary in a way where they're still playing with gender a lot and aren't like completely gender neutral could be very cool.
A Loki-esque gender fluidity where like just change what you look like on a whim all the time, just whatever you feel like. Kind of fun.
Yep.
Yeah, I think my main hope is maybe less specific. I mean, Renarin, of course, but less specific. Just Brandon becoming more comfortable with these ideas and learning to write them with maybe a little bit more finesse than we have gotten in the past.
Relax.
I appreciate that he's trying, and I hope that he continues trying. His first couple books were not very good either. It's always a learning process to get better, and this is just a new skill that I'm glad he is attempting to get better at it. So.
And there's other times where he's done this, where he has gotten a lot better, particularly in like characters that have autism. Like the difference between the characters in Elintris versus like Steris is a lot. So I definitely think he's going to continue to improve.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess in that case, it is time for Who's That Cosmere Character?
This character is from Rasarr.
Menace. Tien.
Tom.
Raise.
Hoid in drag on a horse.
It's time for Who's That Cosmere Character? Caw.
Welcome to Who's That Cosmere Character, the game show where you send in 5 clues and a character to WTCC@17shard.com, and our panelists have a chance to guess who's that Cosmere character. So the first one is sent in by user Little Moss, who have they been on Discord? The name sounds familiar.
Maybe.
Anyway, so clue number 1. This character is in a relationship.
Ooh, very apt.
Jasnah.
No, it's not Jasnah. Very topical.
Mizra.
Okay.
Not Mizra.
5 clues about Misra would be hard. I will say
Not even
Steris.
sure if like Grace would accept that with like how small a character she is. Alyx.
Said someone, and now I've forgotten who is. Steris.
Not Steris.
Okay.
I'll say Navani.
Not Navani.
Dalinar.
Not Dalinar. So clue number 2, this character is female.
Mm.
Vin?
No,
Hesina.
not Hesina.
You're saying in a relationship, you do mean in a romantic relationship, right?
What is a relationship?
It's a relationship.
Just check.
Yes. Well,
Okay.
this is super topical. Yes,
suddenly
in a
got worried.
romantic relationship.
Serene.
No, not Serene.
I'm gonna say Mare.
No, not Mare.
Siri.
Not Siri. Okay. Clue number 3. This character is Terrace,
Tindwyl.
not Tindwyl.
Oh.
So it's like a list
other
of the like
are there?
characteristics we wanted for like the Era 3 Mistborn
Yeah,
main
right.
character.
I don't remember names is the problem.
Yeah.
Do you think I remember Era 2?
I was like,
Maybe a bit out of left field, but Melan?
No, not Milan.
I guess it's
She's not
by
Terrace, I
heritage.
don't- Yeah,
Yeah,
she's
she's a
all the-
Kandra, so she
all
would
the
be a
Kandra
former.
Are
Well, no,
True.
Sort
Oh,
of
that is
descendants.
real clever.
but Milan is a later generation, so she was never a
I mean, she
terrorist
was.
person.
Wasn't she made into like? Weren't like all the terrorists? Well,
Yeah.
Aren't all the mistrapes? Is that the word? Mistrapes.
Yes.
Former terrorists.
Yeah, I guess it's like so, but she would have no like memory. Like she's not like the first generation.
Yeah, but like
yeah,
heritage-wise, she would be.
Yeah, I
Heritage-wise,
guess.
she would be.
yeah.
Yeah. Either way, it's not Melan,
Mistborn.
so doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's a
I-
fun one though.
think this has to be Wax's grandmother, but I don't remember her name. I don't remember. I feel like she must have a name, but I don't
Probably
recall it. Nope.
I mean, I'll
That's
answer
who
just
I
on
was
that.
thinking
It's not
too,
Wax's
but I also don't know
grandmother.
the name.
Oh, it's not her. Ooh.
Not
Hmm.
Max's grandmother.
My guess is Ideshwi
No, it is not
was the
Aidashi.
murdered victim.
Mm.
Oh, good one.
Clue number 4, this character is a world hopper.
The
Chris? No, Chris is not.
doesn't Demu have a terrorist wife? Was it one of the three folks from the Pure Lake vision?
They were all
men.
dudes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but one of them has a girlfriend, I think. I don't remember Mr.
Wow.
One very well.
This is like
But I'm pretty sure one of them has a terrorist girlfriend.
This is so not my
Cool.
question. It's
Oof,
like
yeah.
mistborn
Yeah.
people.
Is that your guess, Rasarr?
Yeah, the girlfriend, Demois's girlfriend. I don't remember her name.
It is Demora's girlfriend.
Wow.
Her name is Asladin.
Right.
Oh.
Wow.
Good
Sneaky,
job.
sneaky.
So clue number 5 was this character tended to the wounded in the Battle of Hassan.
Wow.
Man, I was like, a
so,
lady in
next
Rhythm
one.
of War isn't in a relationship. I was totally lost. Oof. Anyway,
Okay,
yeah.
so second, who's that Cosmere character? This person just has their full name in it, so I'm not actually going to say it for privacy, and I don't know if they want it attributed to their real name, so I'll skip that bit. But clue number 1, this character first appears at a party.
Elend.
No, it's not Elend.
Chris? I mean,
No, it's not
Invisible?
Chris.
I'm gonna go with a classic Matt guess and say Shanna Lariel.
No, it's not Shannon Lariel.
I'm new, but you guys have already infected me with the what is a party? Like,
Right.
I'm just over here going, is that one time that Dalinar and everyone was eating in the flashback? Was that a party?
Go for it. Maybe.
Okay, I'm going for it. I'm going for Evie.
No, it's not Evie.
Yeah.
Also, excellent pronunciation of her name. It's definitely the correct one, and Eric is wrong.
I am also going to go Rasarr, and I'm going to say Zeth.
No, it's not Zach.
That's a great guess.
We
That
introduced
is a
a lot
great
of people
guess.
in the prologues, you know?
Okay, so clue number 2, this character had a bad accident with their staff.
Stuff as in the
Can
object
you-
or stuff as in people?
Stuff isn't like people?
People who work for them stuff?
People. Yeah.
Okay.
The lady from Kholinar that Shallan impersonates in Oathbringer. No, she's setting up for a party, so that's not. I am bad at names.
Don't worry, you're not the only one.
I know who you're
That's what that
talking
is.
about, but yeah, I don't know the name.
I'm gonna go off. Gavilar.
No, it's not Gavilar.
I was thinking Gavilar. If you got it, if that was it, I would have been really put out.
Iadon,
No.
the king.
Yeah, no, not Iadon.
I was like, there's some bad interactions with the staff there.
Bad
For sure.
accident with their staff.
Evil
Feels
rituals.
very specific.
These are so specific, and yet
I'm
it's not
worried- I'm
helping
worried-
at all.
I'm worried that this is a Cell
trick?
person. So I never know anybody from Cell.
I know, I'm looking over at my books
One
and
of
being
the
like,
nobles that's just like,
The classic gotta stare at the bookcase to try and
Right,
remember the
for
characters.
inspiration.
I know I have to guess
Rasarr, did
still,
you
but
guess before?
I suppose I was talking about the Kholinar lady. I don't know if we count this as a guess.
Okay, I wasn't sure if that was actually your guess or not.
I know I could guess again, just ignore the Kholinar lady.
It's up
'Cause,
to
like-
you. I didn't really register it as an actual guess, hence my question.
Yeah, because I realized halfway that no, that's not other party. So maybe. Oh god, I'm forgetting the name I'm going to say.
Describe them.
In Bands of Mourning, the woman, the lady who has the radio with suit speaking through it.
Yes, that is correct. Lady Celestina Shores. Congratulations,
Wow.
you got both of them.
Nicely done.
Very nicely done.
Alexina.
No, can I just
so-
say that I've been
Yeah.
in 2 episodes of Shardcast so far, and I have 3 Who's That Cosmere character guesses. I am very happy with myself.
Ian.
There we go.
Good one. Yeah.
What were the other clues?
The other clues were this character is a revolutionary. I don't know if
revolutionary?
that's meant to be revolutionary.
probably.
It
and then
might be
this character
revelationary in the sense. It might be revelationary in a sense that she reveals about the existence of radio and the plans of suit.
Oh, yeah. That
Oh,
makes sense.
Revelatory would be the word there.
Yep, maybe.
Oh.
And then this character was worse off after losing their jewelry, and this character owned a radio.
I had no chance.
So I'm
with either
glad
of
you
these
said radio
questions.
because I wasn't fully sure which book this character was in. So I was like, oh, radio, cool.
Yep.
No chance.
Very
No chance
cool.
with these ones. They weren't Stormlight, so
Yeah, they're both Mistborn, both eras. I actually thought that first one was era 2 until I got to the end of it. I was like, oh, okay, never mind.
I am recalling now that she does show up in Hero of Ages. I remember that. But it's so brief. So brief.
Well, thank you for watching, everyone, and thank you for joining me, everyone, on this episode. You can find us at 17thshard.com for all your news, discussion, theories, and fun that you could ever want. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, SoundCloud. You can leave us a review on iTunes. You can subscribe on YouTube, and you can also support us on Patreon. See you next time. Bye.
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 Life before death, Sander fans.
Caw.